The white supremacist gang owned the east side of the prison yard. Everyone knew it. Everyone stayed out of their way. Everyone except the quiet Asian inmate who walked through the gates that morning. He looked too small for the jumpsuit, too calm for a man entering hell. He carried his lunch tray with both hands, moving like someone who'd never been in a fight in his life. That was all the gang needed. "Hey, China boy," their leader snarled, kicking dirt toward him. "You bow to us when you walk through our yard." Laughter exploded behind him. Someone flicked peas at his back. Someone else mimicked kung fu noises. And finally, one shoved him hard enough that his tray hit the ground, rice scattering across the concrete. The Asian inmate didn't shout, didn't flinch, didn't even pick up the tray. He simply straightened his posture, and the entire atmosphere shifted. A guard watching from the tower narrowed his eyes. That stance, he'd seen it before. Feet rooted, shoulders relaxed, hands still. The gang leader smirked. "What's that supposed to be? Meditation?" But the inmate's voice was soft, almost sad. "I warned you not to touch me." The yard went silent, because that tone, that stillness, that breath didn't belong to a victim. It belonged to a man who had trained his whole life not to fight, but who could end one in a single heartbeat. And the next 10 seconds would make everyone in that prison learn why mocking a Shaolin monk is the last mistake anyone ever makes. Stay with me until the end, because what happens next in that yard will change the prison's power forever. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video, hit subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. Now let's get started. The concrete walls of Millfield Correctional Facility had witnessed every kind of violence imaginable over the past 30 years. Gang wars that painted the walls red, riots that brought in the National Guard, individual beatdowns that left men broken for life. But what the guards would witness on this particular Tuesday afternoon would defy everything they thought they knew about power, about strength, and about the quiet man they had processed just 72 hours earlier. His name was Chen Wei, though the intake paperwork simply listed him as inmate number 4291. The booking officer had barely glanced up when Chen arrived. Just another Asian face in the endless parade of criminals flowing through the system. Drug trafficking, the file said. 5 to 10 years. Nothing unusual about that. Nothing that suggested this soft-spoken man with calloused hands and patient eyes would become the most talked-about prisoner in the facility's history. Chen had been silent during processing. Silent during his first night in the cell. Silent during his first breakfast in the cafeteria, where conversations stopped and heads turned to study the new fish. He moved through the routines of prison life with an almost meditative quality that unnerved both guards and inmates alike. There was something unsettling about a man who seemed so completely at peace in a place designed to break spirits. The Aryan Brotherhood controlled the East Yard with iron discipline. Their leader, a mountain of hatred named Jake Kozlov, had built his empire on fear and racial violence. His arms were covered in swastika tattoos that told the story of 20 years behind bars. His crew of 12 loyal soldiers moved through the prison like wolves, marking territory and enforcing their twisted version of order. They had rules about where different races could walk, where they could sit, what they could say, and those rules were enforced with brutal efficiency. Jake had been watching Chen since the moment he arrived. Something about the Asian man bothered him beyond the usual racial hatred that fueled his every action. It was the way Chen carried himself, like he owned space wherever he stood, like he wasn't afraid. In Jake's experience, fear was the only thing that kept order in this place. Without fear, the whole system collapsed, and this quiet little man seemed to have none. The confrontation had been building for 3 days. Jake's crew had been making comments, throwing small objects, testing boundaries. But Chen never reacted, never showed anger or submission. He just continued his daily routine with that same unsettling calm. It was driving Jake insane. The other inmates were starting to whisper, starting to wonder if maybe the Brotherhood wasn't as powerful as everyone thought. That Tuesday afternoon, Jake decided it was time to make an example. The yard was full, just the way he liked it when he needed to send a message. Dozens of inmates were scattered across the concrete, lifting weights, playing basketball, or just standing in their designated areas, the perfect audience for what he had planned. Chen emerged from the cafeteria carrying his lunch tray with both hands, walking with that same measured pace that had become his trademark. His black hair was cut short and neat despite 3 days in prison. His orange jumpsuit hung loose on his slight frame. To anyone watching, he looked like the easiest target in the facility. Jake positioned himself directly in Chen's path, flanked by 3 of his most vicious soldiers. The rest of his crew spread out in a loose circle, ready to block any escape routes. This wasn't going to be just a beating. This was going to be a lesson that would echo through every cell block for months to come. "Well, well, well," Jake's voice boomed across the yard, causing conversations to stop and heads to turn. "Look what we got here, boys. Looks like someone forgot to teach the new fish about respect." Chen continued walking, his steps never faltering, his breathing steady and controlled. Years of meditation had taught him to find stillness even in the center of a hurricane, and he could feel the storm gathering around him with each step he took. "I'm talking to you, China boy," Jake snarled, stepping directly into Chen's path. His massive frame cast a shadow over the smaller man, but Chen's expression remained unchanged. "This is our yard, our rules, and rule number 1 is you show respect to your superiors." The circle was closing now. Jake's soldiers moved in from all sides, cutting off any possibility of retreat. Other inmates backed away, sensing violence in the air but unwilling to intervene. The guards in the towers watched with interest, but made no move to stop what was coming. In their experience, these things had a way of sorting themselves out. Chen stopped walking and looked up at Jake with eyes that held depths the gang leader couldn't fathom. There was no fear there, no anger, no submission, just a calm acceptance that made Jake's skin crawl. "You deaf or just stupid?" Jake demanded, his voice rising with each word. "When I talk to you, you answer. When I tell you to bow, you bow. That's how things work around here." For the first time since arriving at Millfield, Chen spoke. His voice was quiet, barely above a whisper, but it carried across the yard like thunder. "I understand your position, but I will not bow." The response sent a ripple of shock through the crowd. Nobody talked back to Jake Kozlov, not if they wanted to keep breathing. Even his own soldiers looked stunned by the audacity of this small Asian man who seemed determined to sign his own death warrant. Jake's face flushed red with rage. This wasn't how these confrontations were supposed to go. The victim was supposed to cower, to beg, to break, not stand there like some kind of statue, speaking in riddles about understanding positions. "You think you're tough?" Jake roared, spittle flying from his lips. "You think those little chicken bones can stand up to what I got waiting for you?" Chen's response came in the form of action rather than words. He knelt down and carefully placed his lunch tray on the concrete, arranging it with the same precision he brought to everything else. Then he stood and took a step backward, his feet finding positions that seemed random to the untrained eye, but were actually part of a stance refined over centuries of combat. The moment stretched like a wire about to snap. Jake stared down at Chen, expecting fear, expecting pleading, expecting something that made sense in his world of dominance and submission. Instead, he found himself looking into eyes that held the kind of peace that came from absolute certainty. "Last chance, monastery boy," Jake growled, his fists clenching. "Get on your knees and maybe I'll let you keep some teeth." Chen's breathing remained steady, controlled. His hands hung at his sides with deliberate stillness. To the untrained eye, he looked defenseless. But the guard in Tower 3 had served 2 tours in Afghanistan before taking this job, and something about Chen's posture triggered a memory that made his blood run cold. "I've spent 30 years learning not to fight," Chen said, quietly, his voice carrying across the silent yard. but you've left me no choice. Jake's first punch came fast and brutal, a haymaker designed to shatter jawbones. He had dropped men twice Chen's size with that same blow, but when his fist reached the space where Chen's head had been, it found only air. Chen had moved with liquid grace, stepping aside like water flowing around a stone. The miss threw Jake off balance, sending him stumbling forward. Before he could recover, Chen's palm struck upward with surgical precision, connecting with a pressure point just below Jake's sternum. The technique was called iron palm, and Chen had spent years perfecting its application. The gang leader's eyes went wide as the breath exploded from his lungs, and his knees buckled. But Chen wasn't finished. As Jake gasped for air, Chen's other hand moved in a flowing circle, deflecting a wild swing from one of the soldiers who had rushed to his leader's aid. The deflection sent the attacker spinning into his companion, and both men crashed to the concrete in a tangle of limbs. The yard erupted in chaos as more Brotherhood soldiers charged forward, but Chen moved through them like wind through wheat. His body flowed from one technique to another, each movement precise and economical. A tiger claw strike to the throat, a crane wing block that redirected a knife thrust, a dragon tail sweep that sent two more attackers sprawling. Years of training at the Shaolin Temple had prepared Chen for exactly this moment. Not the prison, not the confrontation, but the test of everything he had learned about discipline, about control, about finding peace in the center of violence. His masters had taught him that true strength came not from the ability to destroy, but from the wisdom to know when destruction was necessary. The first soldier to recover scrambled to his feet and lunged forward with a makeshift shiv fashioned from a sharpened toothbrush handle. Chen's response was instantaneous. His left hand trapped the weapon while his right delivered a phoenix eye strike to the attacker's temple. The man dropped like a stone, the improvised weapon clattering across the concrete. Jake struggled to his feet, his face purple with rage and oxygen deprivation. This wasn't possible. This quiet little man couldn't be dismantling his entire crew single-handedly. But the evidence was scattered around him on the yard's concrete, groaning and clutching various injuries. "What the hell are you?" Jake wheezed, blood trickling from his nose where Chen's initial strike had caused internal damage. Chen's stance shifted slightly, his feet finding new positions with mathematical precision. "I am what happens when peace meets necessity," he replied, his voice still maddeningly calm. The remaining Brotherhood soldiers hesitated, looking between their fallen comrades and this small Asian man who seemed to defy every law of physics and prison hierarchy they understood. Some began backing away, suddenly remembering urgent business elsewhere in the facility. But Jake wasn't finished. His pride wouldn't allow retreat, even in the face of the impossible. He reached for the concealed blade he kept taped to his ribs, the one the guards had never found during their searches. If he couldn't beat this man with his fists, he would end this with steel. The knife emerged in a silver flash, catching the afternoon sunlight as Jake raised it above his head. The crowd of watching inmates gasped and stepped back further. This had escalated beyond a simple beating into something that could only end in death. Chen saw the blade coming before Jake had fully drawn it. His masters had taught him to read intention in the subtle movements of shoulders, in the shift of weight, in the flicker of eyes. Violence always announced itself to those who knew how to listen. Time seemed to slow as Jake brought the knife down in a vicious arc aimed at Chen's neck. But Chen was no longer there. He had stepped forward instead of back, inside the arc of the blade, his right hand shooting up to catch Jake's wrist. His left hand found Jake's elbow, and with a motion that looked almost gentle, he applied pressure to joints that weren't designed to bend in that direction. The crack of breaking bone echoed across the yard like a gunshot. Jake's scream followed immediately after, raw and primal. The knife fell from nerveless fingers as his arm twisted at an unnatural angle. Chen released his hold and stepped back, watching as the gang leader collapsed to his knees, cradling his shattered arm against his chest. The fight was over. The Brotherhood's reign of terror in the East Yard had ended in less than 2 minutes. The silence that followed was deafening. Every inmate in the yard stared at the scene, trying to process what they had witnessed. The most feared gang in the prison had been destroyed by a man who looked like he should be teaching mathematics at a community college. Guard towers had been calling for backup since the moment the confrontation began, but by the time reinforcements arrived, there was nothing left to reinforce. Just one small Asian man standing calmly among the wreckage of what had once been an untouchable criminal empire. Sergeant Rodriguez was the first officer to reach the scene, his hand resting on his radio as he surveyed the damage. 12 Brotherhood soldiers lay scattered across the concrete. None of them seriously injured, but all of them thoroughly defeated. Their leader knelt in the center of the carnage, whimpering over his broken arm. "What happened here?" Rodriguez demanded, though he could already piece together most of the story from the evidence before him. Chen looked up at the sergeant with the same peaceful expression he had maintained throughout the entire encounter. "There was a disagreement about respect," he said simply. "It has been resolved." Rodriguez had seen enough prison violence to know when someone was lying, but Chen's calm honesty was more unsettling than any deception would have been. This man had just dismantled the most dangerous gang in the facility without breaking a sweat, and he was discussing it like a minor scheduling conflict. As medical staff arrived to tend to the injured, word of the confrontation spread through the prison like wildfire. In the space of 2 minutes, the entire power structure of Millfield Correctional had been turned upside down. The Brotherhood was broken, their leader was hospitalized, and the quiet Asian man who had done it all was already walking back toward the cafeteria to get a replacement lunch tray. Lunch tray. The aftermath rippled through every cell block like an earthquake. Word traveled faster than wildfire through the concrete corridors, each retelling more incredible than the last. By evening count, every inmate in Millfield knew the story. The Brotherhood had fallen. The untouchable Jake Kozlov was in the infirmary with his arm in a cast, and the quiet Asian man responsible for it all was sitting peacefully in his cell, reading a worn paperback novel. Chen's cellmate was a nervous 20-something named Danny, who had been counting down the days until his release. He sat on his bottom bunk, staring at Chen with a mixture of awe and terror, trying to reconcile what he'd heard with the calm man folding his orange jumpsuit with military precision. "Is it true what they're saying?" Danny whispered after the lights went out. "About what you did to the Brotherhood?" Chen closed his book and set it aside carefully. "People say many things in places like this. Most of them are exaggerations. But you really fought 12 guys at once?" "I defended myself when left with no other choice," Chen replied softly. "Violence should always be the last option, never the first." Danny was quiet for a moment, processing this. "What you did today, it's going to change everything. The whole prison's talking about it. Some guys are scared of you now. Others want to test you. And the guards, they're watching you different." Chen stared up at the ceiling, where shadows from the corridor lights painted geometric patterns on the concrete. He had known this moment would come eventually. In a place like this, reputation was currency, and currency always attracted attention. Some would seek his protection. Others would challenge his strength. Most would simply fear what they didn't understand. "Fear is just another prison," Chen said quietly. "I've spent my life learning to be free of it. I won't let it control me now." The next morning brought changes that were immediately visible to anyone who understood prison dynamics. The Brotherhood's table in the cafeteria sat empty for the first time in 5 years. Their usual spots in the yard were taken by other groups who had been waiting decades for this opportunity. The racial boundaries that had seemed permanent just 24 hours earlier were already beginning to blur. Chen entered the cafeteria to find dozens of eyes tracking his every movement. Some inmates nodded respectfully. Others quickly looked away, unwilling to risk even accidental confrontation. A few stared with open curiosity, trying to understand how such a small man could have accomplished what seasoned killers had failed to do for years. He collected his breakfast tray with the same methodical care he brought to everything else. Watery eggs, burnt toast, coffee that looked like it had been sitting since yesterday. The food was exactly what he expected, and he accepted it without complaint. As Chen looked for a place to sit, he noticed the subtle changes in the room's geography. Tables that had been strictly segregated by race now showed mixed groups of inmates. Conversations that would have been impossible yesterday were happening openly. The iron grip of fear that had controlled this place for so long was loosening, and chaos was beginning to seep through the cracks. A Hispanic inmate named Martinez approached his table. The man was heavily tattooed, with tears inked below his left eye that marked him as someone who had seen serious violence. But his approach was respectful, almost formal. "Mind if I sit?" Martinez asked, already knowing that this simple question would have been unthinkable just days earlier. Chen gestured to the empty chair across from him. "Please." Martinez sat down carefully, his eyes scanning the room for potential threats. Even with the Brotherhood's power broken, old habits died hard in a place where survival depended on constant vigilance. "Name's Carlos," he said, extending a calloused hand across the table. "I run with the Latin Kings on the west side. Heard about what you did yesterday." Chen accepted the handshake with a firm grip that spoke of years of conditioning. "Chen, that was something else, man. Jake and his boys, they had this place locked down tight. Nobody moved without their say-so. Now look around." Carlos gestured to the mixed tables, the relaxed postures, the conversations flowing freely. "It's like a different world." "Change was inevitable," Chen replied, taking a small bite of his eggs. "Systems built on fear always collapse eventually. They just needed the right pressure applied at the right moment." Carlos leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Listen, I'm going to be straight with you. What you did yesterday, it's got people talking. Some are grateful, others are scared, and a few are planning to make their move while everything's still shaking loose." Chen's expression remained unchanged, but his awareness sharpened. He had expected this. Power vacuums never stayed empty for long, especially in environments where violence was the primary currency of control. "The disciples are already moving to claim the East Yard," Carlos continued. "They think with Jake out of the picture, they can just walk in and take over. And there's talk that some of the Brotherhood guys who weren't there yesterday are looking to make an example of you, restore their reputation." "I appreciate the warning," Chen said calmly, "but I have no interest in territorial disputes or reputation battles. I just want to serve my time in peace." Carlos studied Chen's face, looking for signs of fear or bravado. Instead, he found only that same unsettling calm that had unnerved guards and inmates alike since Chen's arrival. "With respect, man, I don't think peace is an option anymore. What you did yesterday, it changed the rules for everyone. You can't just go back to being invisible." Chen finished his eggs and set down his plastic fork with deliberate care. "Sometimes the greatest strength is in knowing when not to use your power. Sometimes the wisest choice is to step away from the fight entirely. And sometimes," Carlos said quietly, "stepping away just makes you look weak. And in here, looking weak gets you killed." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of 3 inmates Chen hadn't seen before. They moved with the coordinated precision of experienced hunters, positioning themselves to block potential escape routes. The leader was a tall black man with intricate tattoos covering his arms and neck. His eyes held the cold calculation of someone who had killed before and would do so again without hesitation. "You must be the Kung Fu master everyone's talking about," the leader said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Name's Jackson. I run the disciples on the north side." Carlos tensed, his hand moving instinctively toward the concealed shiv he kept taped to his ribs. The approach had all the hallmarks of a planned confrontation, the kind that usually ended with someone bleeding out on the cafeteria floor. Chen looked up at Jackson with the same peaceful expression he had shown everyone else. "Good morning?" Jackson's smile was predatory, revealing gold teeth that caught the fluorescent lights. "Oh, it's about to be a very good morning. See what happened yesterday with Jake and his boys. That was impressive. Real impressive. But it also created an opportunity. I'm not interested in opportunities," Chen replied softly. "Maybe you should be. The Brotherhood controlled the East Yard for 5 years, collected taxes from every inmate who wanted protection, ran the drug trade, the gambling, the whole economy. Now that territory is wide open, and I'm thinking a man with your particular skills might be exactly what we need to claim it." Chen stood slowly, his movements fluid and controlled. Around the cafeteria, conversations died as inmates sensed the tension building. Guards in the corners shifted their positions, hands moving closer to their radios and weapons. "I'm not interested in claiming anything," Chen said, his voice carrying clearly across the suddenly silent room. "I'm not interested in running anything. I'm not interested in fighting anyone unless they force me to defend myself." Jackson's expression darkened. In his world, refusal was disrespect, and disrespect demanded violent correction. "See, that's where you're wrong. You don't get to just opt out anymore. What you did yesterday made you a player whether you want to be or not. And players who don't choose sides end up as casualties." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a fire that was about to explode. Other inmates began moving away from the area, recognizing the signs of impending violence. Even the guards started calling for backup, though everyone knew they would arrive too late to prevent whatever was about to happen. Chen's breathing remained steady, his posture relaxed, but ready. Years of meditation had taught him to find stillness, even in the eye of a storm, and he could feel another storm gathering around him, bigger and more dangerous than what he had faced the day before. "I understand your position," Chen said quietly, "but my answer remains the same. I will not join your organization. I will not help you claim territory. I will not participate in your wars." Jackson's hand moved toward his waistband, where Chen's trained eye detected the outline of a concealed weapon. The two men flanking him shifted their weight, preparing to move. The cafeteria held its collective breath, waiting for the explosion everyone knew was coming. "Then I guess we got ourselves a problem," Jackson said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Because in my experience, people who aren't with us usually end up against us. And I don't leave enemies breathing. What happened next would be talked about in whispers for years to come, passed down through generations of inmates as a lesson about the price of underestimating a man who had dedicated his life to understanding the deepest mysteries of combat and control." Chen moved first, not with aggression, but with the fluid grace of water finding its path around obstacles. Jackson's hand was still reaching for his weapon when Chen's palm struck his wrist with surgical precision, numbing the entire arm and sending the concealed knife clattering across the floor. The two soldiers rushed forward simultaneously, but Chen flowed between them like smoke, his hands finding pressure points that dropped both men to their knees in seconds. No punches were thrown, no bones were broken, just precise applications of knowledge that left all three attackers conscious, but completely unable to continue fighting. The entire encounter lasted less than 15 seconds. When it was over, Chen stood calmly among three groaning men while the cafeteria erupted in chaos around him. Guards rushed in with riot gear, but found no riot to suppress. Just one small Asian man who had somehow neutralized three dangerous criminals without causing any lasting damage. As Jackson struggled to regain feeling in his arm, he stared up at Chen with something approaching awe. "What the hell are you, man?" Chen looked down at him with something that might have been pity. "I am someone who has learned that true power comes from knowing when not to use it. But I am also someone who will not be forced into wars that serve no purpose beyond feeding other people's pride." Word of the second incident spread even faster than the first. By lunch, every inmate in Millfield knew that Chen had faced down the disciples without breaking a sweat. By dinner, stories were circulating that he was some kind of supernatural being who could kill with a touch or paralyze with a glance. The reality was simpler, but perhaps more impressive. Chen was a man who had spent 30 years learning to read violence before it happened, to redirect aggression instead of meeting it with more aggression, and to end conflicts with the minimum necessary force. He was a scholar of combat, who understood that the greatest victory was the fight you never had to have. But in a place like Millfield, understanding and fear often looked the same from the outside. And as Chen returned to his cell that evening, he knew that his reputation was growing beyond his control, creating expectations and challenges that would only become more dangerous with time. The quiet life he had hoped for was slipping away with each passing hour. In its place, something else was emerging, a legend that would reshape the very foundations of how power worked in this concrete fortress. Whether he wanted it or not, Chen was becoming the most important man in a place where importance usually meant a target painted on your back. On your back. That evening, as Chen sat cross-legged on his narrow bunk in meditation pose, the weight of what was happening around him settled like dust after an earthquake. The prison had changed, but not in the way he had hoped. Instead of finding peace through his actions, he had inadvertently become the eye of a storm that was growing stronger by the hour. Danny watched him from the bottom bunk, still trying to process everything he had witnessed over the past 2 days. "Man, you know there's gonna be more coming for you, right? Jackson's got connections. The Brotherhood still has soldiers who weren't in the yard yesterday, and now everyone's talking about some kind of alliance forming against you." Chen opened his eyes slowly, his breathing remaining steady and controlled. Fear makes men do foolish things. It also makes them reveal their true nature. But aren't you scared? I mean, even a little bit? Chen considered the question carefully. Fear was a natural response to danger, but it was also a choice. You could acknowledge it and still move forward, or you could let it paralyze you completely. Fear is information, Chen said quietly. It tells you to be prepared, but it doesn't have to control your actions or cloud your judgment. Chen served the remainder of his sentence in a prison forever changed by those 2 encounters. The racial lines that had divided Millfield for decades slowly dissolved. Violence dropped to its lowest levels in the facility's history, and the quiet Asian man who had caused it all continued his daily routine of meditation, reading, and finding peace in the center of chaos. Sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one who looks the least threatening.